1 week season.
Hey, welcome in OWS fam. Thanksgiving edition here on the DFS Lab. I'm joined by Mike Johnson and Xandamere. And guys, Thanksgiving slate is upon us. One of the best times of the year. And what we're going to do on today's show is we got perspectives of two of the main contributors here for 1 week season. And we're just going to be talking through not building like an entire lineup per se, but building more of a shell. Mike is going to take one game, Xandamere is going to take one game, and really thinking through like how would you build around this game, maybe a couple different directions based on like the potential for a late swap. So I'll just toss it to you guys as we get going here. Again, this show kind of focused on late swap strategy. So Mike, I'll ask you first, like, how do you kind of approach these short slates with the spread out games and just in trying to build for late swap?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of factors that are in play. Obviously, any short slate has different things that are going. Like we're coming off the afternoon only slate from this last week was just a 3-game slate. So very much similar from like if you just look at it like from a blanket perspective, like of the slate, but it introduces such a dynamic when the games all have those staggered start times. And it's not even like, on an NFL main slate where the early games go on. Well, usually there's 2 or 3 of them that aren't even finished when the second wave is starting. So it just changes a lot that you have time to process, hopefully without upsetting your family. But you have time to process and kind of look through, your rosters, your opponent's rosters, see where you're at, and kind of, digest the information. It's like if you've ever seen the movie 21, the old movie about the card counters in Vegas from Harvard.
I love that one.
I think it's Harvard.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But the analogy they talk about how you have that once you have that information, the variable probability once you have different information. So I think that's kind of the biggest factor in this. And then just in general on these short slates, even coming like, using this last week as an example, everything else, be damned. Like it came down to like, you were going to have Cortland Sutton, Josh Jacobs, and Trey McBride, to win on that afternoon only slate. They were key on the main slate too, but on that afternoon slate, like if you didn't have all 3, like there was no chance you were going to win. So I think those 2 factors are a couple things you've got to keep in play with being able to use the variable probability and the staggered start information to your benefit. And then I guess kind of having some conviction and trying to identify, what are those plays likely to be, first of all, and then are there players who can be that play that you can get at potentially lower ownership than they should? And I think those are kind of the 2 overriding factors that shape how I approach my rosters.
Absolutely. And by the way, your background there is making me hungry just looking at it. If you can make a spread like that, I think your family will be fine if you
they'll be fine if I walk away for a little late swap action.
Hang on though, except what I see in the bottom right is clearly a turkey and not a prime rib.
That's right. That's right. You were talking on the Slate podcast, weren't you, on Saturdays, Xandamere, about you're just not a big turkey fan, yeah? And you really should avoid it anyway because
turkey is a lunch meat. Like it's fine, right? Like a turkey sandwich, that's great. I am happy to eat a turkey sandwich. But as the centerpiece of a meal for a big holiday that's all about food, like turkey's just, I don't know. It doesn't excite me.
Well, yeah. And if you are going to eat turkey, you got to wait till late in the day so that you're not sleepy from the tryptophan for when you need to late swap. Can't be
from a game theory perspective.
Can't be accidentally, taking a midday nap and forget to sweep from Achan to Tyreek. And
oh my God. See, this is the best call ever. Now I have like actual DFS information that says prime rib is clearly the more plus EV play because it gives you energy. It gives you energy to make those decisions with your mind sharp. Whereas turkey just knocks you out.
We want our opponents eating a lot of turkey as early in the day as possible.
Yeah, man.
I'm
And
glad it's another angle for my turkey call. I love it. Thank you, Mike.
I love prime rib, dude, so much. It's so good. Yeah, turkey's just, and it's hard to, cook it well. It's difficult.
Anyway.
All right, Xandamere, how do you look at these the late swap stuff?
Yeah. So okay. I mean, I'm broadly speaking, I'm aligned with Mike, right? Like Mike brought up a really interesting point, which is that, looking at the last, I guess 2 days ago, there were basically 3 must-have players on the afternoon slate. And then, Sutton, Josh Jacobs, and Trey McBride. And then if you wanted to win one of like the big GPPs, like the 10,000 or plus, like the number of must-have players expands from there, right? Because you need to be closer to perfect, right? But like in a smaller field, if you just had those 3, and no duds around them, you were in good shape and had a realistic shot at a takedown, even if you didn't have perfection around them, right? You could have missed Vele, for example, who had a solid game, or Ani or Abdullah, perhaps, right, who had a solid game. Like you could have missed those guys who were in the optimal lineup, but not, but you didn't necessarily need the optimal lineup to win a smaller field. So like you want to think about the contest you're entering first of all, right? And then think about, who has those ceilings? If you're entering the really large field stuff, you probably need to start dipping down on the 3-game slate to figure out where are the lower owned guys who could get a long touchdown, like say a Kavonte Turpin, who all he seems to do is score 60-yard touchdowns on 2 touches a game. Or you look for just where you get different in construction. Like remember, there's multiple ways to get different. Playing a low-owned play is one of them, but you could also get different through your lineup construction. So, for example, overstack, like playing 6 players from one game, is going to be a very uncommon strategy on this slate. So it doesn't just have to be about a single player being low-owned. You can sort of make game environment bets where you're saying, what happens if the other 2 games disappoint, and then this game is a shootout, and we get 6 great scores from this game and 0 to 1 great scores from the other games. So just keep in mind, there's lots of different ways to get different. At the end of the day, the way I think about these slates is that information is power, right? Like, and as Mike said, right, we get more information as the day goes on. We need to recognize that most DFS players, anytime aren't going to late swap. Like, it's been years since I've seen this data, but I remember like at one point, FanDuel got rid of late swap for NFL, and they shared some data that basically said something like only like 3% or whatever, some really low number of players use late swap. And so we don't, like, people say they want late swap, but it actually hurts most players. It hurts casual players, especially. We think this is a, sort of more player friendly decision to make. Then they brought it back because players demanded it, but players still use it, right? They just don't do it. And so I think that's especially true on a holiday when, it's like Uncle Ben who is, entering a lineup from the couch before game 1. But then by the time game 2 starts, he's 6 beers in and 4 turkey legs and he's passed out, right? Like, so he's not late swapping.
Sounds like a good time.
So it sounds great time as long as you don't have to swap Achane to Tyreek Hill. So, that's the reason that this slate is so plus EV in my mind, is because you get so many more casual players playing it, and also because the vast majority of players aren't going to utilize late swap. So those of us who were able to do it, who were in a position to be able to intake that information to make decisions off it and swap, we have an edge. That said, my honest advice is, if you can't do that, if your like family/holiday situation means that you cannot get away to go look at what happened and spend some time on it, and make late swap decisions, it is not a good idea to play this slate for anything more than just a few bucks for entertainment, right? Like if you want to do that for entertainment, have fun, right? DFS it can be fun, it can be a blast, like play it for fun, but don't play it for serious money if you don't have the ability to invest the time to manage the slate as it goes, right? But like we get information as we see who's hit, we see who's failed, we see where ownership is. And one thing I will note that it took me a while to actually kind of figure out, embarrassingly, is when you're thinking about ownership on a slate like this, it's not just about like how owned an individual player is. Like, oh, this guy was projected to come in at 30%, he came in at 40%, and then he failed, and so 40% of the field is dead. That's cool and that's useful information. But what you also want to understand is like how much total ownership has been used already. So, for example, like let's say you after the first game that you're not winning anything, and you're like, oh no, I'm behind because I'm not in first place in the tournaments. But let's say that the average roster you built has only used 3 players. Like the total sum of ownership on your rosters is 300%. 3 players used on average. And the total sum of ownership being used by the field, DraftKings makes this super easy. You just download the CSV and add and sum up all the ownership. If the average ownership of the field is 500%, you're sitting pretty, because what that tells you is that most of the field has 5 players from this game, and you only have 3 on your average roster. So you actually have, a lot more PMR left than the field still does. So you want to understand like the context of what's left and what's happened by looking at individual players. Oh, I had a lot of this guy and he did well. I had a lot of this guy and he didn't do well. Shoot, I was way overweight this guy and he did not have a good game. What should I do? So you want to be looking at individual players, but also the context of the field and the slate as a whole as we get more information that comes in, and then making decisions off it. So the simple thing is, when playing from ahead, you can play chalk. When playing from behind, you need to think about getting more different. And this is something you should be doing every week. But as Mike points out, going into the afternoon games on a Sunday, we don't have all the information yet. The early games are still going. And imagine if you'd made swaps based on, say, like, let's say you had a Jaden Daniels and Terry McLaurin lineup and in the early games, and then you're like, oh, what dud. I better swap off all the higher owned plays in the late games because Jaden Daniels and Terry McLaurin didn't do well. And you make that swap, and then the afternoon games lock, and then Jaden Daniels hits Terry McLaurin for an 80-yard touchdown. You're like, well, crap, right? So there's a big difference between the main slate where you don't have that last bit of information at the very end of the games, and a slate like this where you have all the information. I mean, unless we get like a weird, super slow overtime situation, I don't even know if that's possible. Like, I don't even know if it's realistically possible at all for these games to overlap, even if they go to OT. I kind of don't think it is, right?
Yeah, like, probably not regular season rules.
Yeah,
because it's just one overtime. So
yeah, you need a way to get like double or triple OT in order to have enough time to stretch out. Unless there's some like delay in the game, right? Like there'd have to be some big delay in the game. But otherwise,
so
you're gonna have all the information.
Xandamere, you download a CSV of the ownership from the first, like as soon as the game's locked, you can download something from DraftKings that'll show you ownership?
Well, it's only going to show you ownership for what's locked, of course, right? But so, I mean, there's not a live contest to go look at right now on DraftKings. But if you go to like the DraftKings lobby, sorry, I'm trying to like remember the exact way to find it. If you go to DraftKings lobby, then in the lobby, once you click on the sport, there's an option that says view live contests.
Oh, right? Yes.
And so once you're viewing live, in fact, there are live contests. There's Monday to Thursday contests. So you click view live contest and you see the contest you're in. And then on the left-hand side, there's like the leaderboard that shows first place, second place, like the rankings. At the bottom of that, there's a little link that says export lineups to CSV. And you can download all of the lineups in the contest, and it only shows you who's locked, right? Like it's not going to show you what a guy played for the next game, obviously. But it will show you what's locked already. And so you can see like what's locked, what hasn't locked. You can see where you are. Like, for example, I'm looking.
Pull this real fast. Let me pull this.
Yeah, okay. I'm looking at one for like. Okay, you're seeing. Yeah, so like I'm looking. This is the same one I'm looking at. So like, this is a Monday to Thursday contest, right? So it had last night's showdown and then had 3 games on Thanksgiving. And so you can look like.
Sorry. I'm going to go back and do that again because
go back.
Sorry. Okay. So you go to watch, and then pull down, here.
So don't download. But let's look real quick. So for example, like let's look at some of this ownership. We had Zay Flowers, we had Lad McConkey at 42% and 43% respectively. Both flopped. Lad is possibly okay. We had Will Dissly at 51% ownership, put up 8.7 points. Like, so if you played this slate and you didn't play, I mean, really, if you didn't play anyone from this slate, no one really smashed. Mark Andrews probably the closest. But if you just skip this game, you're feeling good. And by the way, this is an old DFS strategy of playing the full week slate and skipping the first game, right? Like, because people like to sweat things, right? And so you tend to get overinflated ownership on the first game of these like multi-day slates because people like to have stuff in play. And then see that export lineup CSV button at the bottom left. If you do that, it'll export a zip file. You can unzip it and then have an Excel file that shows you all the ownership, and you can look it up and you can just sum the ownership together to see like how much the field has played so far, which is a super, super useful tool if you're trying to evaluate the slate's going. You also want to consider combinations. For me, one thing I really like to do, so I'm an MME player, right? So if I'm building 150 lineups for a contest, one thing that I like to do on a slate like this, instead of building 150, is build 50 and enter each one 3 times. And the point is, the reason I do that is I want to make sure that when I get the combinations from the first game right, I have multiple like permutations of that to then build off of. So like, let's say the right combination of the first game was Gibbs and Laporta and, Odunze. Like, I want to make sure that I have multiple iterations of lineups with just those 3 players from this game. And the easiest way to achieve that is to start from a lower number of rosters that are duplicated. It's like, that's a trick that I like to use for multi-entry to make sure, because like I've done it the other way where I've done 150 and like the first game passes and I go like, okay, there's the optimal players. How many do I have? And I have like 1, and I'm like, oh crap. Like, guess I better get the other players exactly right now. So I like to I like to have multiple shots on goal. And for me, the way to achieve that is by building copies of lineups to start with. And then I sort of I distribute them later throughout the day.
Yes, no, I love that. And like you said, I mean, if you don't have time for this, don't put in 150, because you're just going to be tossing, money into the fire. I mean, is there like a tier 2 to that? Is there like a tier in between? Like, let's say you don't have an hour and a half, but you have, 15 minutes where you could just like Hilo, I just talked to Hilo, so you can check the video out, but he's like, timing your bathroom breaks, is one strategy. So it's like
bathroom strat is key on
like,
Thanksgiving.
Kind of not a multi-entry like approach, not like just all for fun entertainment purposes only, but kind of a middle tier where it's maybe like you're building 10 to 20 lineups, but building like 7 lineups and putting it in 3 times or something like that. Is that still something that you think you can manage?
Yeah. If you have, if that's where your bankroll is, and depending on what you're looking to do and stuff, you can also find the ownerships on the mobile app. If you just go to like where you would normally look at like the standings, there's a players tab, and then you can sort by position, and then you can filter it by ownership. So you can get like a quick look. So, if you just have a few lineups, or even if like, if you did a lot of lineups and there's only a few that are left and you don't need to go through the whole, the whole gamut, you can get like a quick overview, quick look without, if you've got that 15 minutes, like you said.
Yes. See, we're giving people different strategies like that. Like, I don't think I would have time to download and sort through a CSV, but I would have time for that. So
again, this is the generational divide, right? I'm like, you sit at your computer and you download the file and you find it on your desktop.
I'm there too. I would do
Mike's
that.
like, use the mobile app, you idiot.
And I'm doing it during the bathroom break.
I'm trying to like haul my desktop computer to the bathroom and set it up in there. Like,
Yeah, but
I think Mike's
if you have it on a roller cart, then that would work.
This is great.
Well, also, what's I gonna say? Oh, Showdown also, right? Like, there's big showdowns for each of these island games on Thanksgiving. So, if you don't have if you're not sure that you'll have the bandwidth to say follow lineups throughout the day, you can play Showdown. Maybe it's easier for you to play the first game and the last game because your family eats around the time the second game starts. Whatever, right? Like, based on your schedule, like Showdown's a great option if managing a portfolio of lineups through a full day main slate doesn't work, then consider Showdown, right? It's a great spot. You can also use Showdown throughout the day to hedge outcomes you need. So for example, let's say you're going into the late game. Let's say that you've stacked Chicago-Detroit heavily. And let's say that Chicago-Detroit had a really, really strong game and you are currently sitting, in first or very close to first, and you have one player left and it's, I don't know, Josh Jacobs in your flex. And you're like, okay, who can break me? Who can ruin me? Well, I'm going to keep Josh Jacobs because I'm playing from ahead and I want to play the home favorite running back. But, the most likely players to wreck me now are going to either be like Jaden Reed or Devon Achane or, maybe Tyreek. Who even knows what's up with Tyreek Hill?
Emmanuel Wilson.
Right, Emmanuel Wilson. Yeah, Emmanuel Wilson. Jacobs gets hurt, right? Like, RB2s are great plays in Showdown. You can build some Showdown roster and say, look, I'm going to win. If Josh Jacobs has a good game, I am a big favorite to win this tournament and take down 20 grand or whatever. So it's worth it to me to then go enter $1,000 in Showdown, or what the numbers I'm making up, right? But like, it's worth it to me to enter something in Showdown to hedge what happens if Jacobs fails and someone else hits instead. Like, I love doing that. And one of my biggest wins on a slate like that, where like I had Tyreek Hill in the late games when he was still in the Chiefs, and if he had a good game, I was going to win a lot of money. And he was going to be massively owned because it was an afternoon slate, and he was like the clear top option receiver. And so I decided to build 150 late afternoon lineups with 0 Tyreek Hill, and I played like their backup wide receivers. I played like Byron Pringle, who ended up having a huge game at no ownership. And so like they just didn't play Tyreek Hill that game for whatever reason. Like it was like late in the season, a game they didn't need to win. I don't remember the context, but point being is like those hedge strategies.
Yeah.
If you're in a spot where you need that one last thing to go your way to win, it can give you sort of additional equity that says, okay, if this doesn't hit, what's the most likely thing to happen, and how can I leverage that?
Yes, man, absolutely. I love how you use those financial terms like equity with it, because I mean, it just kind of gives this.
I'm a finance geek.
Yes, it's very good. Awesome. Well, unless you guys have anything else kind of on a theoretical level, I'm excited to kind of jump in. And so I've got these multiple tabs open. Each of you guys are going to be kind of taking a different game that you're going to kind of talk through how you'd build it. So which one of you guys wants to go first? Mike, you're going to take Chicago, Detroit. Xandamere, you're going to take Miami, Green Bay. That's not saying that, Dallas Giants isn't going to go off, but
it certainly is now. That's going to be the lowest end of the games, right? It's the least obvious game, right? Like there's 2 games that look very, very obvious as the ones that we want to stack up.
Yeah.
So,
no one wants to play Tommy DeVito versus Cooper Rush, but so who wants to go first? Mike, you got the first game. So you want to, so we'll kind of go back and forth though. Like you kind of get a start, Mike, and then we'll jump over to Xandamere so we kind of keep the popcorn effect here.
Yeah. So yeah, building around that game, I just finished up the NFL Edge right up for it. And, when I evaluate those games and when I start thinking about how is an offense going to try to move, how are they going to try to attack an opponent? There's 2 things, right? There's 1, how are these offenses going to interact? And 2, are their paths of least resistance? And do they match up? How do they match up with that offense's strengths? So from the Bears perspective, their team total is at 20 or slightly under it, depending on where you look. So, at first glance, that and the Lions defense being a top 5 defense on paper, would kind of make you think, all right, well, maybe not the greatest spot. I do think, I'm not the only one seeing this angle, but, Caleb Williams probably going to be close to the highest owned quarterback on the slate, but it makes a lot of sense. When you look at what I was alluding to before, so the Lions defense, very strong against the run. They've faced some of the highest opponent pass rates in the league for the last 2.5 years. And the Bears, their offensive line is 28th in the league in adjusted line yards per rush attempt. So really probably going to struggle to run the ball. The last 2 games since Shane Waldron was let go, they had a game where they led for a while against the Packers. It was kind of a low play volume game. But Caleb Williams' dropback rate was like 63% in that game. And then last week against the Vikings, it was 78%. Vikings, like the Lions, are a high blitz rate, high pressure team. So now they're going to struggle to run the ball. How are they going to try to throw the ball? Well, Keenan Allen, usually he had coming off a big game, but he is primarily slot receiver. Had a nice game last week against the Vikings, who lead the league in zone coverage. The Lions, on the other hand, lead the league in man coverage. And they have an all-pro defensive back, Brian Branch, who's probably going to be lined up on Keenan Allen most of the time. So what I see is with Caleb Williams, you've got DJ Moore in a low 8-out role. They're manufacturing him touches. I love him paired with Caleb Williams. And then the rookie, Rome Odunze, fellow top 10 pick. He's running a route on basically every play. Struggled a little bit against the zone last week, but he's going to get chances. He's leading the Bears in average depth of target, and he's got 10 targets each of the last 2 weeks. So he's getting thrown the ball a lot, and he's getting thrown the ball downfield. So that's where we're going to start out, is with Caleb, Moore, and Odunze to kind of build around that. And
can I jump in for just a second and say, I love the way you're thinking through the Bears receivers. Ownership projections right now are really, really fragile, but I'm just kind of looking, and we don't have ours up yet, to be fair, right? But I'm kind of looking around the industry and seeing that right now it looks like the consensus is that Keenan Allen is likeliest to be the highest in Bears receiver. That might change, right? That could very well change. But if that holds, I would argue that is a catastrophic mistake. I think that you are spot on in your analysis of the likeliest Bears receivers to succeed here, and getting the best pass catching options at the lowest ownership is just like chef's kiss, right? That's the dream for tournaments.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think, I think DeAndre Swift as a pass catching back, and then Cole Kmet, who's playing basically every snap with Thomas Brown as the offensive coordinator. So I think they're in play as well. On this lineup, I'm not going to go there, but I think every Caleb Williams lineup I have will have at least one of Moore or Odunze. And then it'll always be a double stack. So it'll be one or both of them. And then if I only have one of them, then I'll add either Kmet or Swift to it. But for this one, we'll just keep both receivers. And then, part of that is staying within the same game. The Lions, so they're facing the Bears. The Lions have the best running game in the NFL outside of Baltimore. Most productive backfield because, they don't have Lamar Jackson. So you look at them and then you have the Bears defense. So similar, like how are they most easily attacked? Well, they lost Andrew Billings, their run stuffing defensive tackle, a couple weeks ago. They're 30th in the league in run defense DVOA. They set up perfectly for the Lions to just shove it down their throat. So I think that one way or another, you're going to have the Lions running game in some way on this, on this slate, either Gibbs or Montgomery. I would be shocked if one of them is not in the optimal. So we're going to go with Jahmyr Gibbs. Montgomery battling a little injury, whatnot. So we'll see there. But I think he'll play. But either way, I love Jahmyr Gibbs, so we'll roll with him. And then at tight end, Sam Laporta. So we saw TJ Hawkinson come to life against the Bears last week. And again, the Bears pass defense, they're called a run funnel because they are so easy to run on, but that doesn't mean that their pass defense just is across the board terrific. It's not like it's a top 3 unit. So you've got what you have is Jalen Johnson, one of the best cornerbacks in the league, but he doesn't really shadow. He's not a perimeter guy, or he's solely a perimeter guy, basically. And so you saw last week, Jordan Addison and TJ Hawkinson each went over 100 yards. So they can get beat that way. And I'm going to go with Sam Laporta here at tight end. He's just last year's tight end won $4,100. I'm sure he'll be popular, but I'll live with that here. And then, play into some uniqueness the rest of the way.
Awesome. So like if this is if your main focus is Chicago, Detroit, and you're building, kind of focusing on that game, I don't know how many lineups you're planning to build, but are you kind of trying to take some different approaches with this as well? Like if Caleb Williams fails on the road, or do you think that if you're building around this game, you're going to be this is going to be your core pretty much throughout your lineups?
Yeah. Like I said, I think if I'm building around this game, it's going to be the Chicago passing game.
Yeah.
I think Goff could have a good game. I mean, we saw the game against the Jaguars, obviously.
Outlier.
So I think that,
but yeah,
but also like the biggest mistake I think that one of the biggest mistakes people can make on these short slates is trying to account for every outcome and trying to be like, well, but what if this, or this could happen too. So I think just like picking like some like conviction. Sorry, you guys froze for a second. Am I good here?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
We froze for a sec, but I think we're still rolling.
Okay.
You still there, Xandamere?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay.
So
cool.
Picking some like conviction spots, like from a macro standpoint, like how you think it's going to play out, and just sticking with it. Because even if you have a lot of lineups, if you are trying to play too many outcomes and too many scenarios, then you're not actually giving yourself that many chances, to Xandamere's point with how he does the, 3 iterations of his lineups. You're not really giving yourself a chance to hit it. So, if I'm building around this game, it's probably going to be that way. I do think it's viable to, you look at this stack and you've got Gibbs at 7,500 and Laporta at 4,100. And then the other guys are all right around that, like 5,100, where it's like, they're not, I haven't spent a ton of salary, so I've got a lot of options with how you use the rest of the lineup. I also think it's viable. Like, you could take this and you could just remove Caleb Williams, because he could have a game where he throws for 350 yards and both Adunze and Moore score a touchdown, but he throws 3 or 4 picks. Maybe, and just the way often on the main slates, we talk about salary multipliers, and those become less of a factor, I think, on these shorter slates, because it's more like a 4X doesn't matter as much as like, where do you rank among all the players at your position on that slate? So, from that standpoint, like Moore and Odunze, they could both be top 5 wide receivers on the slate, but one of them could have 17 points and one of them could have 25. And maybe Caleb Williams only has 15 or 16, and you benefit from playing a Cooper Rush or a Jordan Love or something.
Yeah, no, I like that.
I would note that especially DraftKings, more so than FanDuel, sites tend to price players down for holiday slates. They want to make it more casual friendly. So because of that, you can't play whoever you want, but it's honestly pretty close. Like, you can salary is not a big factor in this slate, right? And so there's 2 trains of thought that come off of that. The one is what Mike's talking about, which is that raw points matters a lot more than salary multiplier when salary is less of a factor. 2 is a point that I kind of forgot to mention earlier that I feel like I should have mentioned, which is that when we talk about ways to get unique, this slate, because of the soft pricing, has it's more analogous to a showdown slate, where one of the best ways to get different is just not spending all your salary. And it's important to understand how most people play the game. Why this is an edge is that most people play the game by saying, who's the best player I can fit in, as they work through their lineup. And like, well, okay, who are the last 1 or 2 players I can fit in? Who are the quote unquote best ones? And if you have enough salary to fit Amon-Ra St. Brown, it's a real tough click to go click, say, Malik Neighbors or Jameson Williams instead of Amon-Ra St. Brown, right?
For real.
But is it possible that one of those guys could outscore Amon-Ra St. Brown? Of course it is, right? Happens all the time. So think about leaving salary as another differentiator. Otherwise, I love what Mike said too about, like, you can't cover all your bases, right? Like, this is a real, and the shorter the slate, the easier it is to fall into the temptation of trying to cover all your bases, right? This was a lesson early when I started focusing a lot on Showdown that I really had to learn is, when you're Showdown, you're only covering one game. And it's like, well, sure, I can try to play a little bit of everybody and cover every base. You can't. Right. The number of, even in one game, the sheer number of lineup permutations is, near infinite, far more than the 150 lineups you're allowed to enter. So, you've got to decide, like, where am I willing to take stands? And there's sort of 2 philosophies of DFS when it comes to tournament play, and especially multi-entry tournament play. One is, play a little bit of everyone and try to take sort of slightly overweight or slightly underweight positions compared to the field, and hope through correlation and then good fortune that you will have a lineup bubble up to the top. The players who play this kind of way, you will see them complain a lot about, oh, I had all the right plays, just not in the right lineup. And it's like, well, no shit. You had 150 lineups. You had 3 with this guy, 2 with this guy, 4 with this other guy. The odds of those guys all being in the same lineup were 1,000,000 to 1. So, like, of course you didn't have all in the same lineup. Just I had all the right plays. Yeah, but so did everyone else, right? Your odds of having the right lineup are tiny. You have to be, to quote one of our articles on the site, Lorejo's article, you have to be willing to lose in order to have a good chance of winning. If you play that sort of like play everything strategy, what you're likely to experience is a very slow bleed of your bankroll over time. You're not going to have weeks where you hit 0 because you've got enough combinations that are so different that you're going to have some lineups cashing every week. So you're not likely to hit 0, but you're also very unlikely to hit first unless you get really lucky. Like, let's say you play well and you're in a big tournament and you play well and you place 2% of your lineups in the top 1% of rosters. Cool. That's 3 lineups. And in a 10,000 person tournament, that's 3 lineups out of 100 in the top 1%. So your odds are still only, roughly speaking, 3% to win. I would personally rather have weeks where I place 0 in the top 1% so that when I do nail my core, I have 10 lineups in the top 1% or 15 lineups in the top 1%. And I have a much stronger chance of having things bubble up to actually take down first. You'll have more weeks of negative 100% ROI or close to it in a more focused strategy, because when your core doesn't do well, it's disastrous, and you're going to lose everything. But that when you do hit, you give yourself a lot more chances to actually have the exact right combination that you have a lineup bubble up to first. And so like that's something that I think is even more critical. Like the closer to perfection you have to be in order to take down first, the more important having a tight core of players is. And so it's relevant. That's relevant to our conversation about NBA DFS prior to this, right? And NBA DFS, we were chatting about it prior to the slate, the show starting. You generally need to be closer to perfection to win a tournament. In Showdown, you often need to be exactly optimal to win a tournament. In a 3-game slate, you often need to be exactly optimal or very, very close, right? So the closer you need to be to the optimal lineup to win, the more important it is to have a very narrow core of players to make sure that you give yourself the best odds of getting that right combination when your core hits. And just accept that there's going to be times when your core doesn't hit and you will just lose. And you know what?
Yeah.
If you know that after game 1, cool, go enjoy Thanksgiving with your family.
Yeah, man. Exactly. Just kind of reset things, drink heavily, all that good stuff. No, actually, absolutely not. Don't drink heavily. I mean, if you want to. We aren't giving people life advice. Okay, so
oh God, she's getting into liability trouble.
So yeah, Mike. Okay, so anything else with this kind of shell that you want to add before we jump over to Xandamere's side, and he kind of builds kind of the same kind of theoretical mindset for the Green Bay and Dolphins game?
No, I'm good with this.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So I'm open. Just jump over to the other tab. Okay. So Xandamere, you're going to kind of focus on this Miami Green Bay game. How do you, if you're building for a late swap, and I mean, how do you approach this? Does this mean you're kind of fading that Chicago Detroit, or just building it differently, or what do you want? How do you want to do this?
Sorry, I was muted. There's a couple ways you can approach this, right? One is you can bet that Chicago Detroit flops, that it's just not. And when I say flop, I don't mean that it's like a game that ends 10-3, right? I just mean it's a game that doesn't generate a lot of high-end fantasy scores. The game can still score 50 points, and it without generating a lot of high-end fantasy scores. Yeah. The scoring can be really spread out so that no one gets there, or the scoring can be real. Like Detroit could score 30 points and Gibbs scores 3 touchdowns and no one else does anything, right? Like that's.
Or we could have a bunch of field goals.
Viable.
I mean,
yeah. So there's a lot of viable paths to a game not generating high-end fantasy scores. Now, as Mike noted, high-end fantasy score has a different meaning on this slate when it's only 3 games, right? It's possible that a wide receiver scores 17 points and that's a top 3 or 4 wide receiver. That is a possible outcome, right? So anyway, you could bet that this game flops and only has, 0 to 2 or 3 high-end fantasy scores that come out of it. Or you could bet the game hits, but just Miami Green Bay hits harder. And so what I mean by that, and like how you'd think about that, is how many players you want to play from each game. So like I tend to think that on small slates, overstacks are a very plus EV way to play. So what I mean by overstack is I don't mean like a QB and 1 pass catcher and 1 bring back. I mean having like 5 or 6 players from one game. Pick the one game you want to build around, have 5 or 6 players in that game. Because that's a way to get around the ownership conundrum of small slates. So like Green Bay is going to be highly owned on this slate, as it should be, right? Lions can be highly owned on the slate, as it should be. Very few rosters will have 4 Lions or 5 Lions. Very few rosters will have 4 or 5 Packers, right? It's like even 3 is less common, but like the heavier you build around one team, or on one game, the more likely it is that you're going to be different, even if you're playing players who are individually very highly owned, right?
Yes.
The combinatorial ownership is lower because a lot of players, when they're building by hand, they're just like, okay, I don't want, how can 5 Packers get there? Whatever. Or they're building in optimizers, and they're often using rules that say things like, max 2 or max 3 running back, wide receiver, tight end from the same team, right? So they're actually they can potentially be using rules that block them out of hitting the nuts on a slate. On a main slate, those kind of rules make more sense. Because you have so many different games that it's harder for one game to reach these sort of stratospheric levels required for like 4 or 5 players from a team to be optimal. On a smaller slate, it is much more likely that, one team just outscores all the others, not just in real football points, but in the way the fantasy points are scored and distributed among their team. So with that, I am going to be focused on, overstacking the Miami Green Bay game. And so for me, that means at least 5 players from this game. And like when I'm building, I will build, like I'll put in the optimize office a rule that says, you can do it by team, like at least 2 Packers, at least 2 Dolphins, something like that. Or you can do it by like setting a group of players, like add up, Achane and Jacobs and all the pass catchers, all the primary pass catchers from each team, and have a rule that says lineups must have at least 5 of these guys, and then build. Right. And I'll do that with, say, 50 lineups. And then I'll go do the same thing, but for Chicago, Detroit. And I'll run that with 50 lineups, right, to overstack that game. That's how I usually approach 2 or 3 game slates, is I just try to overstack one game or one game at a time, and hope that's, hope the scoring is sort of widely distributed where one game flops, the other game hits. And that's how I can, because I don't feel that my strength as a player, or that how I want to approach these, is to try to find like the 1% player who hits. I'd rather try to find the game that hits than the 1% player that hits, right?
I like that.
So I'm going to start, and I'm going to start on the Packers side because I'm a Packers fan. I start with Jordan Love.
You are too?
Sort of. I mean, I'm a Packers and 49ers fan because I grew up in California. And so I grew up watching the 49ers with my dad, but then like the Packers, when I started kind of getting into football, like I was friends with a bunch of Packers fans. And so I just kind of like fell into that fandom as well.
A lot of Packers fans.
So let's plug in Jordan Love.
Yep.
Now, Romeo Doubs is listed questionable. He left the game last week with a concussion. On a short week, it's challenging for a player to get cleared from the concussion protocol. So I'm assuming he's out. And so now I can basically pick, a couple of Packers pass catchers. And so I'm going to go with Jaden Reed, who is I think Jaden Reed is their best pass catcher. The volume is very hit or miss for Jaden Reed, making him an awesome tournament play. I mean, he has multiple games of 30 plus points this season, but also a bunch of games of single digit points. And then we'll go Dontavian Wicks, Dontavian Wicks is a tremendously frustrating player because he's really good. All of his like advanced metrics are awesome. And yet he's sort of buried on the depth chart until someone gets hurt. He's going to be a popular play because he's cheap and he is very good and people know that. But that's okay because, again, remember what I'm doing here is I'm trying to win through the overstack, like Green Bay scores 5 touchdowns scenario. I'm not trying necessarily to win through avoiding the high-owned individual players. So then we're also going to plug in, and you can put him in the flex, Josh Jacobs. So I'm going to do the same thing Mike did. I'm just going to build the stack of this game to start with. And then coming back, I'm going to put one Miami player who is going to be Jalen Waddle. And, you could go either way here. I could play Waddle. I could play Johnny Smith. I could play Tyreek Hill. I could play Achane. Tyreek Hill, God, I feel like I'm ready to give up on him. Maybe I shouldn't because like that's the time he's going to hit. But like he hasn't had a good game since week 1. And if you also, it's not just the wrist thing. Like if you go look at his average separation from defenders on his routes, it is way down from his career norms. Like way, way down. Like he used to be. I mean, Tyreek Hill is fast as hell, so it would stand to reason, and you'd be correct if you were guessing this, that he's generally been in his career one of the best receivers in the NFL at achieving separation from defenders. Currently this season, he's like slightly below average. So it's not just like whatever's going on with him isn't just the wrist, right? Like he was and I'm pulling this, Scott Barrett, one of our friends over at Fantasy Points, posted this morning, actually, that Tyreek Hill in 2022, 6th best receiver in average separation score. 2023, 12th best receiver in average separation score. 2024, 45th best receiver in average separation score. So, it's not whatever's going on is not purely the wrist. Like there's something else happening, and he's not getting younger. And like maybe he's starting to hit the egg. I don't know. Maybe he's starting to hit the age cliff. Point being, he seems like a tough play. And it's like I've kept playing him this season, but it might be more the brand name at this point than the actual legitimate upside. So I'm going to go. So Waddle and Achane are my favorite Dolphins. And I'm just going to go Waddle. Like I don't want to, Achane's viable in this lineup too. Of course he is, but I'm going to go Waddle in this lineup because I think that if Tyreek Hill is truly, hobbled, maybe isn't the right word, but just not what he once was, it makes sense that that Waddle would shift into sort of more of the wide receiver one role. Waddle's been probably Waddle's been a top 2 or top 3 wide receiver 2 in the league for a couple of years now, right? And so it's not like he's some guy who's being shoved into the work because the guy in front of him hurt. Like, Waddle is awesome. He is one of the best pass catchers in the league. So I am like, he's the guy for me if his role is big, and he's just not priced like his role is big because it hasn't been for most of the season. So that's going to be my core for this lineup. I will also have lots of Achane. I'll have some Johnny Smith. I'll have some Christian Watson, some Tucker Kraft. Like, when I stack games like this, I want to stack them sort of every which way because it's hard. It's easier to predict games than predict what player in that game has a big game. It's easier to predict the game environment. The team's going to score. I will also even include what's his name on the Packers? Help me, Mike.
Heath?
No, Bo Melton. Bo Melton.
Oh, right.
You could argue Heath too, I suppose. I don't know. Like, I guess I have a blind spot with Heath in that I just generally think he's bad. And maybe that's a mistake for me because he's the one who actually caught the touchdown last week when Doubs was out, and he got 2 targets and Bo Melton had 1. So either way, I think either of those guys totally viable to include if you're building a bunch of Packers stacks, because the Packers have continued to rotate 4 wide receivers. Like, some teams use their top 3 wide receivers at a near, every down pace and barely use their sort of other rotational guys. The Packers generally have a history of using sort of a 4 wide receiver rotation. Where Doubs has generally been the guy with the highest snap count, and so he opens up the most in terms of snaps for other players. I don't think that it's going to be Reed, Hick, Wicks, and Watson who play 85, 90% plus the snaps each. I think that you're going to see rotation. You're going to see a meaningful number of snaps from either Melton or Heath, and maybe it is Heath. But when I say meaningful, 40%? 40% of snaps ish, I'd guess, for the wide receiver 4 on the Packers feels pretty reasonable to me. And at min price and at probably very low ownership, like, that's a way to differentiate. And if I'm stacking the game, I want to make sure that I get exposure to that, because there's also no crappier feeling than getting the game stack right and just missing the right player.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so so this is your Packers score. Okay, one question that I have to ask, I know we're kind of getting long on time, but unless you guys had anything else, maybe we could close with this, but or we can still talk about some more stuff. But so for your Xandamere, for example, like, if you're building this Packers stack with a 3-game slate, are you, like, based off of how the early game goes, are you making many changes to this, like, after the first game? Because I mean, why would you? Or at least in my mind, why would you? But maybe you can answer my question. With a game that's already gonna be late.
Well, so absolutely, right? So, like, let's finish the lineup really quick, and I will say, right, like, really quick, the lineup that I had built for this was Jahmyr Gibbs, Rico Dowdle, Cole Kmet, and Lions D. There's a few permutations you could do around this, right? Like, you might say, oh, it's weird playing Cole Kmet and Lions D together. It is, actually. It is a little odd. But 2 things. One, I'm already betting that the Chicago-Detroit doesn't, like, that game doesn't smash. And so that means that, like, one of the ways to get there of that game not smashing is the game just never getting off the ground because the Bears can't score, which is a perfectly viable outcome. So Lions D, a very reasonable play. But then why Cole Kmet? Well, for one, I can afford any tight end in this except Johnny Smith.
Hey, who's the other running back again? Sorry.
Dowdle. So I can afford any tight end on this except for Johnny Smith. I probably don't want 5 Packers on most of my lineups, and so having Kraft probably out. I could do Laporta. Laporta's very reasonable in this lineup, right? You're just betting the Lions or dismantle the Bears. I think Cole Kmet is interesting because I think that he is the tight end who has the second highest ceiling on the slate behind Jonnu, to me, with whatever's happened with Sam Laporta this year, where he's just fallen off a cliff. Cole Kmet has, he already has a game this year of 25 points and 24 points. So two leagues. He had 10 targets last week. And he can get there, like, wide receiver and pass catcher and opposing defense are, the negative correlation between them is very, very weak. And on a slate, like a 3-game slate, allowing a pass catcher against your defense is a very easy way to achieve differentiation.
Yeah.
And my basic thought process here also is like, if I'm like, the Packers are not going to not sneaking by anybody, they're going to be really popular. And so if I'm going a Packers stack, like I do need to think about how I differentiate away from like how everyone else is going to be building for this. So now to your other question about how you change things. So let's say hypothetically that Chicago, Detroit either A, goes off and has, multiple big scores to come out of it that I don't have, or B, maybe it doesn't like go off, but maybe Gibbs only scores 8 points or Kmet scores 4 points, right? The game doesn't go off, but my lineup isn't looking so great. So there's two options at that point. One is I could switch Dowdle. Dowdle's probably going to be a pretty highly owned running back. So like, for example, I could take Dowdle out. I could move Jacobs into the running back spot and then play someone else in the flex. Or I could just flop Dowdle over because I have 600 because I played Cole Kmet instead of Sam Laporta. I have 600, and that would let me get from Dowdle up to Tyrone Tracy, who is projected to be meaningfully, at least currently, and probably will be because the Giants have the lowest team total on the slate, so I don't think he's going to come in very highly on. So that would be like a pivot I can make, go to Tracy, or I can move away from Dowdle and move to a pass catcher. And then another angle is I can also mix up the stack for this game. Like I think that Love is going to be one of the highest on quarterbacks of the slate. So like I could switch from Love to the other side and play Tua. And then switch from, and then have like switch into more Miami players. I could switch Jacobs over to Achane, or I could play Jacobs and Achane by moving, say, Reed down to Malik Heath. So like if I'm playing from behind, there's a lot of optionality that I have because I have so many slots left. Right? I have so many slots left to make changes. And that's one of the reasons, like, for me, I tend to shy away from overstacking the early game because I feel like the more flexibility that I have available to me, like the more decisions I can make, the more levers I have to pull to make changes. Now, the flip side of that is if the first game smashes, all the changes and all the levers in the world don't matter, right? If none of the levers result in better outcomes. But that's my natural tendency, that I tend to like to skew later where things can only help me. Or like, what if we get late news, for example, like this might not happen, this might not play out, right? But currently, like what happens if Tyreek Hill currently has a questionable tag? Romeo Doubs currently has a questionable tag. What if Romeo Doubs plays? No one's going to have him. If we don't get the news, like if he's a game time decision, we don't get the news until the other two games have locked. Like the more optionality you have, the more space you have to take advantage of things of late news that changes things. And we might not have those Q tags; they might be erased before we even start the slate. But like if they're there, I think they're things you want to think about. And you want to think about how can I plan for this going either direction, and how can I benefit from that.
Absolutely. And awesome. And then Mike, I'll toss it to you, kind of same question. What adjustments are you making based on how kind of your Chicago Detroit stack goes? And then I think we can probably safely close it out from there. I'm going to jump over to your team here. Oh, you're muted. There we go.
I had too much tryptophan. When you build around that early game, you have you have a pretty good idea how your lineup is looking. Like, if this game doesn't go well, which I have pretty high confidence in this game in terms of how the teams are going to attack, the play volume, the passing volume from the Chicago side, Detroit being able to run. So like, I don't think it can totally fail, but you'll have a pretty good idea for a lineup like this. Did the Chicago volume and touchdowns go somewhere else? Did Montgomery and St. Brown get all the Detroit side? So you'll know, like, did you hit the nuts of that game or not? And then you can kind of build from there. How do I have kind of the must-haves from there? And if you're playing lots of lineups, you can kind of focus on which specific lineups do you want to dive into. For this game, I do think most of the guys that I have are probably going to be highly owned to moderately owned. So it's not like I'm going to have separated myself. So then it becomes, what size tournament are you playing? And how big of a game did you have? Because if they have a solid game, but Caleb Williams had 18 to 20 points, there's a decent chance that Jordan Love or Tua have a better game, or that Cooper Rush matches him or something like that. So you've got to kind of dig in at that point to some of the other things we've talked about with ownership and whatnot. A couple of the interesting kind of leverage points. X alluded to it. Tyrone Tracy, rookie running back. The Giants were embarrassed last week, but they're playing on national TV. I would think these guys have some pride in that, as opposed to just being one of 7 games on Sunday when they're all kind of pissy because Daniel Jones was released. And Jones, you think a few years back, Antonio Gibson had that huge game on Thanksgiving. I think JM had his big win with the 3-touchdown game. So, I think that's an interesting spot. I think that it's just a matter of how you want to approach it. Tyreek Hill will probably be lower owned just because of everything X said is true about him, but also like at some point in the next 2 or 3 weeks, if he has one game where he just busts off, is anyone going to be shocked? Probably not. So I think there's a lot of different ways to go about that. And then once you have that information, you can decide based on your contest how off the board kind of you want to get. And then if you play a couple guys, maybe a defense and Tracy from the middle game, the Dallas game, then for the night game, you can really see where you're at, and you can see like, okay, am I duped with 2 or 3 other people probably have the same lineup? If so, okay, let's say you have Devon Achane in your roster at the flex, and he's highly likely to outscore Christian Watson. But also, can Christian Watson have a 25 to 28 point game? Absolutely. And that could be, if you're going to split first place with 6 or 7 other people, if Achane outscores him, or if Watson or pick your poison for, cheaper Packers wide receiver or whoever you want to play with them, you're probably going to be unique because people don't want to leave that $2,000 on the table. And you probably wouldn't if they were all starting at the same time. But when you have all the rest of the information, you just need that one thing, then that's where, you're getting your pot odds, and it can pay for leaving a bunch of money on the table and maybe not doing the optimal thing for most points, but the optimal thing for most money.
Absolutely. Love that. Exactly. And like you said, playing against the psychology there. So, guys, great stuff. I think that, this has been some really valuable content. Guys, as you can see down below at oneweekseason.com, there is some Black Friday promotions going on, just some really good stuff. So make sure to jump in there and, see, what they have to offer. And, I think it's a great opportunity. So guys, any other thoughts before we close this out and send people off to finish their Thanksgiving prep?
I'm good.
Xandamere, Mike Johnson,
Eat
guys.
prime rib.
Yes, absolutely. Xandamere's going to be having his prime rib. Man, it's too late to pivot for me now, but I am kind of jealous. So enjoy your prime rib.
Negative EV play, my friend. Next year.
I know. I'll wait to eat it until at least I've made some adjustments. Okay, guys, have a great Thanksgiving. Good luck to Thanksgiving slate, and we will see you hopefully at the top of the leaderboards and on the site throughout the week. Guys, thanks for your time. We'll see you.
Thank you.
See ya.